that was a little bit of Pony Blues by Charlie Patton. Today is the 12th of January, 2026, and we're going to do part 2 of our subgenre episode of Beginner at the Crossroads on Delta Blues. Why are we doing a part 2? Well, I'm in the process of reading an excellent book by Ted Gioia, that is Gioia, not how you'd expect one to spell Gioia, but that is the spelling. It's called Delta Blues, The Life and Times of the Mississippi Masters Who Revolutionized American Music. This book does a great job talking about the origin story of Delta Blues, not just the musical story of where it came from, but the commercial and public policy story of how it was recorded, how it spread, what the historical and technological and cultural context was. So let's talk a little bit about that context, and then we'll talk a little bit about Charlie Patton and how he came to prominence. So we want to talk about the years. We're talking about the years between 1927 and 1930 for the most part. If you're a student of history, you'll know the stock market crash happened in 29, and the Great Depression, at least as it was experienced by most of the country, followed that for quite a while. Arguably, the foundations of the Great Depression were already there, but in the experience of the average American, they had more disposable income than they had ever had before, immediately prior to the Depression. And there were some exciting new technological things going on. Radio was getting common to the point that most homes could tune into the radio. Phonographs were getting affordable to the point that many Americans, black and white, had phonographs in their homes and were avid consumers of recorded music. Prior to this, the entire music industry was predicated on three things, really. There were recordings for people who were wealthy, who were early adopters of the phonograph, but those recordings weren't great. The microphone was just coming into prominence in this period. Prior to the microphone, the recording process used a horn that would use the vibrations in the air, the actual sound itself, to move a stylus that would engrave recording on wax or shellac. Once we had the microphone, those vibrations were transformed into an electrical impulse that could be used to control a stylus more precisely. Microphones still were not perfect, and we're not anywhere near the level they're at now, but it made recording a little higher quality and a little more accessible. So we're talking about a world where music is something you can sell in recorded form to the majority of the people in the country for really the first time ever. So there were record labels out there, there were musicians out there, but how did they find each other? Well, a few different ways. You had the public policy side of this, where Allen and John Lomax and other representatives of the Library of Congress were traveling the country looking for musicians to record. This was not something they were paid for. This was an attempt to preserve the traditions of folklore and folk music in America. And this persisted and even grew somewhat during the Great Depression because Roosevelt's New Deal included efforts to fund the arts and to revitalize the arts and to pump money into industries that are not in their own right recession-proof. So we do owe a debt of gratitude to the efforts by the government to collect this music. But there was another stream too. There was this commercial stream, which really reached its first crescendo right before the Great Depression. You had a few prominent record labels, and they had discovered, in some cases to their chagrin, because it was not considered respectable, that the music of African Americans, which was sometimes perceived as scandalous or dangerous or too sexual or improper in some way, was very popular among black and white audiences. And black and white audiences had their money and were willing to buy recordings of what they wanted to hear. So there kind of emerged this job. Now, some record companies would hire talent scouts who would travel the country and look for these musicians. Other record companies were approached by or managed to hear about and find existing talent scouts, men who had usually started in other businesses. One of the prominent talent scouts in the Delta was a furniture maker who started selling phonographs and then realized he could also sell records. So he bought recording equipment and started making records. Another, probably the most prominent, was Henry Spear. Now, Henry Spear he was described in Joya's book as somebody who dressed like a banker and thought like one too, which tells you kind of a great deal about the entrepreneurial spirit involved here. This is a guy who would, hear about you or just be in town on business and hear you playing and offer to record you. In many cases, he would charge for the recording. He would charge a nominal amount to cover his risk. But if the recording sold a lot, you could potentially be called in for more sessions. You could potentially come to the attention of a label. At first, Spear just recorded and released this music on his own, but he became involved with labels as this process became faster and gained momentum and gained national recognition. So the second, character in this story is really not a character at all. It's a place. We're going to talk about the Dockery Plantation. Now, the Dockery Plantation is a very large community in the Mississippi Delta, and it was kind of now think about the antebellum South. You had these plantations. You had, for the most part, enslaved people who worked these plantations and lived on them, usually in something like barracks or little cottages, depending on the size of the plantation and the population. And their people who owned them, their enslavers, provided what services they needed to get work out of them, and not much more. So obviously somebody with a broken leg can't do agricultural labor for you, so you provide some medical care. You provide some kind of religious exercise, whether that's to sincerely seek the salvation of their souls or to keep them quiet and obedient. That's a matter for historical debate. I imagine both were at work. But we're not talking about the slavery area anymore. We're not even talking about Reconstruction. We're talking about the sharecropping era. This was a period when usually wealthy white men would own, sometimes the same man would own the plantation that used to be worked by slaves, and it would be worked now by tenant farmers, people who lived on your property, consumed services on your property that you provided, and paid you usually very high share of their agricultural output, and were left with enough wealth after that and some food through subsistence farming on some of their land to survive, but in most cases not to thrive. Now, there was a big variation in these plantations in terms of how they treated their tenants. This particular plantation, owned by the Dockery family, was, by the standards of the time, considered extremely generous and philanthropic. Now, we can talk about how fair that is, how much consent you have in the terms of your employment when you're a tenant farmer and there's really nowhere else to go. By modern standards, we're talking about something that's still brutally exploitative. But as these plantations go, the Dockery family in general, and William Dockery, the man who owned the plantation at the time in particular, were considered unusually generous. Will Dockery was a very straight-laced man, wore a suit all the time, attended church, did not drink, did not smoke ever, but he advocated for his tenants. He, by all accounts, paid them well by the standards of the time, and he would be indignant at their treatment by others. He had heard that there was only one doctor in the area who would attend to the African American population. The others wouldn't treat them. But Dockery heard that physician was overcharging his black tenants, so he was enraged by that, and he went with his own money and hired a doctor to provide services for everybody on his plantation, regardless of their ability to pay. He also provided schooling for the children. He provided multiple churches on the grounds. He had at least a Baptist and Methodist church that he funded, and he allowed worship of other kinds. by the standards of that time and place, that made him a great philanthropist and greatly admired by the African American population. Now, this was not a man who was, open to black music for the most part. In fact, it was disquieting to him that his own son at one point wanted to learn the piano. He didn't like music at all. He thought music was a degenerating and sensual influence. But he tolerated people on his plantation playing this music, and thank God for us, because this is the place that Charlie Patton came out of. This is the place that Son House came out of, and a bunch of other significant names. We're going to mention the Dockery Plantation. Where are we here? So, now his son, Joe Dockery, was, by all accounts, much less favorably disposed to the African American population, much less generous, much less fair. And when the folk revival happened in the 60s, and people started showing up at his plantation asking about this music from 30 years ago, he was kind of scandalized and disgusted that this had come out of his family's plantation, this music that he saw as a negative influence. And he also, before his retirement to just run the plantation, he was the commissioner of Parchment Prison, which was a notorious prison in the area that also figures prominently in the history of the Delta Blues. Son House sings about it. A lot of people sing about it. It comes up a lot. So really we have like two characters in this historical drama that aren't even people. We've got this plantation, this kind of breeding ground for black culture at the time. And we have this prison where, which was frequently sung about, which was kind of a symbol of oppression, but it was also another breeding ground for people to make this music, and a place that the Lomaxes went at one point to record prisoners and the folk traditions that they were privy to. So here we are in this context of 1927, 1928, and Henry Spear records Charlie Patton for the first time. And this was kind of the golden stretch for these recordings. Like I said, the Lomaxes continued recording, but there wasn't all that much money in music during the Great Depression because people didn't have money for records when they couldn't afford food. So this was kind of a golden window. And the reason we read about so many people who, this is kind of the case with Son House. This is definitely the case with Mississippi John Hurt. The man recorded one album worth of material in 28 and then went back to his farm, Cincinnatus returning to his plow. And he didn't really play again that we know about until the folk revival in Greenwich Village happened and people started seeking him out and showing up and writing to the Dockeries and trying to track down census records so they could find this guy. And eventually they did find him, and they bought him a nice guitar, and they recorded him several more times, and they had him at the Newport Folk Festival. But this is kind of like the perfect storm moment in American history where this music could have been recorded and distributed, and then the worst possible thing happened, a total decimation of the music industry. And then decades later, this revival happened. So it's kind of this weird providential story arc where all these guys who were just doing subsistence agriculture suddenly had income and then just as quickly lost it. And it was just like a fever dream that was over. And decades later, many of the survivors had second careers. And in the interim, some of the bigger stars also had careers, but it's hard to underrate the impact of these economic conditions on the formation of this music, in particular in the Mississippi Delta. We will look at some other sub-styles later. We'll look at the Piedmont Blues. We'll talk more about Mississippi John Hurt then. We'll look at the Hill Country Blues, also out of Mississippi, but up the road a bit. But yeah, that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at a historical context that was very special, where a lot of things came together, and a man like Charlie Patton could have become famous. And Charlie Patton was well suited for fame. Let's just say that. He wasn't necessarily well liked by other musicians. Like, Son House has like all these negative things to say about Charlie Patton, even though he played with him at some point. He was notoriously amoral or immoral. He eventually had to leave Dockery's plantation because of the scandal created by him sleeping with another man's wife. He moved to another plantation where he apparently had 3 more adulterous affairs and was asked to leave. He was really the first rock star, like all that Hendrix stuff, playing the guitar behind your head on stage. Charlie Patton kind of invented that. He invented the entire idea of having this stage persona, being over the top. We wouldn't really have rock and roll music today without Charlie Patton then. So this was more about the history of the Delta blues than the technical elements and how it's played. We can talk more about that in the future, but for this episode, that's what I wanted to get down. Let me make sure I'm not missing any important points here. Nope, I think that's all we got. Well, thank you very much for watching. I am also going to do a weekly update show today and go over some of what I've been working on. And I'll see you again soon.